All right, we are in the second part of Reconstruction notes. The Reconstruction Act of 1867. After the Swing Around the Circle tour, Lincoln has, holy cow, Johnson has been, he's still in the presidency, but Congress has a veto-proof ability over him. So anything they pass is going to be really overridden anytime he tries to veto it because they have that much support. His Swing Around the Circle tour was that bad. So Congress now is refusing to seat any of the states that were brought back into the Union that they refused to seat under Lincoln or Johnson's plan. This is them now passing the Reconstruction Act of 1867. They are clearly in the driver's seat of Reconstruction now. They are going to divide the South into 5 military zones headed by Union generals. So this is like martial law. This is, military occupation. Union Yankee troops are going to be heading on down there. They're going to try to get those black codes eradicated. And they are clearly Congress in the driver's seat. Johnson is pretty much powerless to stop any of this. The only men that were given any kind of ability to vote were African American men, former slaves, and white men who could prove that they didn't participate in the Confederacy. This is the largest participation of African Americans holding office in American history. We have 14 serving in the House of Representatives, 14 African American men serving in the House of Representatives, 6 serving as lieutenant governors, and 600 serving in their state legislatures. That's because the only ones allowed to vote were African American men and white men who didn't participate in the war and could prove that. Under the Reconstruction Act, clearly driven by the radical Republicans, is that each of the southern states to get back into the Union has to elect delegates to their state legislature that are agreeing to rewrite their state constitutions. In their state constitutions, and Virginia's going to be this, so this is a new constitution for the state of Virginia. They're going to have to outlaw slavery in their new state constitution, and they're going to have to outlaw those black codes. They must, after they write their new state constitutions, outlawing slavery and outlawing the black codes, they're going to have to ratify the 13th, the 14th, and eventually the 15th Amendment to get back into the Union. The fear was that, the state legislatures, when they got back into power, that they would, try to undo the Emancipation Proclamation. So an amendment is more permanent, an official change to the Constitution. Once achieved, once they rewrote their state constitution outlawing slavery and the black codes, and they ratified the 13th and 14th and eventually the 15th Amendment, then they could re-enter the Union. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment gave African Americans citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. And 20,000 United States federal Yankee troops are sent in the South to enforce this. And like I said, this is like martial law. Each district, and you can see the districts here. Virginia was District 1. This is District 2, District 3, District 4, District 5. Each of the districts is going to have a military governor in charge enforcing all of this. Johnson, of course, is going to veto it. He hates it. He's a white supremacist. And Congress is, like I told you, a veto-proof Congress. They're going to simply override his veto. During slavery, African Americans weren't legally allowed to get married. So this is from the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. African Americans overwhelmingly are trying to solidify their marriages and get marriage certificates that would legalize their marriages. And so Johnson, he's not very happy about the plan. So he's really trying to replace some of the military governors that the Radical Reconstruction Congress have put in place. He's trying to replace them with more lenient governors. And so what's happened here is he's really obstructing the Radical Reconstruction Congress's plan. So they've made it their mission. They got to impeach him. They're going to kind of set him up. They're going to pass a law that they know he's going to break, and then when he breaks it, they're going to file charges of impeachment and try to remove him from office. Impeachment, remember, is the legislative power's ability to check on the other two branches, and in this case, the executive branch impeaching the president. They passed the Office of Tenure Act. This is on the quiz, and basically it forbids the president from firing cabinet members without permission. Just remember, the president appoints cabinet members, so he has the power to fire them. And when he appoints them, they need to be confirmed by the Senate. But in order for him to fire him, they don't need to be confirmed. And so this is really, really an unconstitutional law. But it would take years and years and years for the Office of Tenure Act to reach the United States Supreme Court. By that time, he'd be removed from office. So he is looking to fire one of Lincoln's cabinet. He kind of took on all of Lincoln's cabinet heads and, just kept them. And they have not remained loyal to him. They are spying on him and reporting back to Congress and kind of telling Congress what he's up to and what his next move is and such. So he wants to fire. He wants to fire, of course, Edward Stanton. And the law technically would be totally unconstitutional today if it ever got that far. But anyway, it would take years for it to reach the Supreme Court. And so it clearly violates the separation of power. So when Johnson broke the law and he fired Secretary Edward Stanton, you saw him in the movie because he was spying on Congress, they brought impeachment charges up on him. The House is going to impeach him, just like they did Donald Trump, just like they did Bill Clinton. And they're impeaching him, charging him for breaking the law, Office of Tenure Act, bad language, and a disgrace to the office. The Senate is going to have a trial, and they're going to find him not guilty by one vote. It's a very hard bar to remove a president through impeachment. They need a 2/3 vote. And he stayed in power by one vote. That's the closest vote to remove a president in American history, including Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. So we're going to move to this video right now. Let me come here. You can see this, and this is pretty important. Coming out of here. Congress is definitely now in the driver's seat. Coming back to our notes. Once he's been removed from office, Congress has the wherewithal to pass the 15th Amendment. Again, Congress is thinking about the moral right thing to do. 15th Amendment grants African American men the right to vote, but also the thinking about selfishly what happens when all these southern states and all these southern white Democrats get back in power. They need to make sure that the African American man is able to vote, to keep them in power and not be outnumbered. So this is what the 15th Amendment says. No one can be kept from voting because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Obviously talking about slavery. Will the South violate this? Yes, definitely. If you know how, give me these 3 ways in a remind message, and I'll give you a point. Okay, so economically speaking, sharecropping becomes the main mode of mechanism for how the South is going to survive. The South is destroyed. We already talked about it's like the poorest place on the planet after the Civil War. The plantation owners, they have all the land, but they have no labor, and they have no money to pay any workers. This former slave, the freedman, he's able to work, but he has no land, and obviously the two are going to work together. This is a solution. The former plantation owner, he divides his big fat plantation of hundreds of acres, and he lends each of his former slaves a few acres and loans them some seeds and some tools. And then when the harvest comes, he's got to give the freedman half of his crop, anywhere from a quarter to a half of his crop to the old plantation owner. And then he can sell the rest of his crop to try to make a profit. But he has to pay for the seeds and the tool and the renting of the land. And so literally he's doing all this work for like only half of his crop. It's pretty devastating. And so this is sharecropping. You can see the map. This is where sharecropping was most prominent, was all those red areas. But it's also happening in those orange areas and those yellow areas as well. And these are just some pictures of sharecropping. Okay. After Andrew Johnson is removed from the presidency, they're going to turn the Republican Party to the former general from the Civil War, who was a hero in everybody's eyes. Y'all remember he's from Ohio. He's a poor student. He had failed at multiple businesses. The only thing he really was good at is the military. He had gone to West Point and fought successfully and was decorated from the Mexican War, but he had resigned because he was miserably homesick and started to drink. And that's when he was about to get dishonorably discharged. And so he quits, and then he goes back and he joins his father's business, and he can't make that a go. But then the Civil War starts, and he joins the Civil War, and he rises up through the rank of military stature, getting the notice and attention of Abraham Lincoln before he names him late in the war, 1863, as one of the head generals, the top Union general. But basically, he is now elected president overwhelmingly after Johnson's impeachment. The problem with him is he's going to have one of the most corrupt, this is on the quiz, presidencies in American history. He makes a mistake of appointing his friends to his cabinet positions and using that system that you guys remember we saw Andrew Jackson start. If you can tell me what that is, for a point, send it to me on Remind, but basically this is the reason for his bad presidency. Literally the most corrupt presidency with the most riddled of scandals in American history. He leaves office in poverty and dies by 1885. This election is really important because this is the election that's going to end Reconstruction. The Republicans are going to choose Rutherford B. Hayes. He's honest. He's clean. The Democrats now, all the southern states are back in the Union, so they have full electoral power. They're going to choose a Yankee, but he's a Democrat from New York, governor of New York, Samuel Tilden. All the southern states, like I said, back in the Union. They've written their new state constitutions. They've outlawed slavery. They have representatives and senators, and white southern males are voting again. Tilden carried the popular vote, but he's one short of the electoral vote. And y'all remember Electoral College, you got to get a majority of those or you don't win the White House. So 20 electoral votes are up for dispute because in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, the KKK put cannons outside of the booths and kept the African-American male from voting. And so they weren't going to count those. That's why nobody was able to achieve a majority, because they threw those electors out. So Congress appointed a commission to investigate, and obviously that commission is going to decide the presidency. When this has happened before, 2 times before, that the House of Representatives has to decide who the president is going to be. If you know those two, send them to me or Remind for points. Oh, there they are. Never mind. Can't send them to me then. All right. And so the commission comes up with the compromise of 1877. And the Democrats are, look, we'll give you the White House. We'll let the Republicans have the White House, even though our dude got more votes, even though our dude was, just shy of a majority of electors. You can have the White House, but we want federal troops out of the South. We want an end of Reconstruction. And basically, that's the agreement. So Rutherford B. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, because a lot of people think he stole the presidency away from Samuel Tilden. And now the white redeemers are back in charge. The South has home rule again. And Reconstruction is over. The white redeemers, they don't want the African American voting, so they are creating literacy tests. They are making the African American able to prove that he can read before they let him vote. Well, obviously during the Civil War, they weren't allowed to read. Freedmen's Bureau has started some schools, but not a lot of them can because they're intimidated from going to schools. Then they create poll taxes where you have to actually pay to vote. And sometimes you'd go to pay and there'd be nobody to take your monies because they didn't want you voting. And sometimes you'd have to pay the poll tax 2 years before the election. So it was obviously a tactic by the white redeemers, the white Southern Democrats, keeping the African American from his suffrage rights that he had won with the 15th Amendment. And so obviously those are poll taxes. Poll taxes will be outlawed with the 24th Amendment. Blacks were remembered, couldn't find anybody to take their money. And then because some of these literacy tests and poll taxes were keeping some white Southerners from voting, they came up with a grandfather clause. And so basically it says to the Southerner, if your grandfather was a voter, then basically you could vote. And so obviously African Americans grandfathers weren't going to be able to vote because their grandfathers were what? Slaves. So this was obviously to try to bring back suffrage rights to the poor white who couldn't pass a literacy test and couldn't pay the poll tax. Okay? And so these are disenfranchisement restrictions, and they are going to be called the Jim Crow laws, and the Jim Crow era begins. Okay? And 500,000 black male voters by 1868. Mississippi law, Mississippi's governor rewrites and says, we came, the white redeemers, we came to exclude the Negro. Like, that's why they're taking office. That's their purpose. In Mississippi, you had to pay your poll tax 2 years before the election. And obviously, you didn't have to pay the poll tax if your grandfather voted under the grandfather laws. Easy passage for whites, recite your ABCs. Very difficult for African Americans to vote. They'd make you recite a part of the Constitution of Mississippi and stuff. Mississippi, with these disenfranchisement tactics, cut black voters by 90%. 60% of the voters in Mississippi were black, but by 1892, only 6% were black. So they were good tactics for Mississippi in their disenfranchisement of the African Americans. Very successful and enforceable by the KKK. And just horrible Jim Crow era begins. And that is the end. Hope you guys are doing well. We'll get through this together. Good luck on the quiz. Just let me know if you need anything. Hit me up on Remind.